Hi, everyone. I'm Susan Hibbard, the Deputy Director of the BUILD Initiative. We're very excited to be hosting this webinar on behalf of the Early Learning Challenge Collaborative, which is a partnership of BUILD and the First 5 Years Fund. The collaborative was started, as some of you may remember, in 2011 by eager private funders, BUILD and FFYF, to support the opportunity for increased federal investment. The collaborative from the outset had several goals, which include supporting states as they apply for Early Learning Challenge grants and as they implement those plans, and then to document the outcomes related to the Early Learning Challenge, both for technical assistance purposes to support states and for purposes of state and federal advocacy. BUILD's role in the Early Learning Challenge Collaborative is to coordinate technical assistance in the learning community activities. And this webinar is the first learning community activity geared toward the round 3 applicants. So we welcome all of you. We were really excited that the registrants represented potential applicants from 21 states in the District of Columbia, including 5 states that didn't get the chance to apply in round 1 but are hoping that they'll get the chance to apply in round 3. At the end of the PowerPoint, I'll say a little bit more about the Early Learning Challenge Collaborative, letting you know about some future webinars that we'll be holding, and letting you know about other technical assistance opportunities that might support you, might be helpful to you as you begin to prepare your application. Most of the materials, there are materials on the Early Learning Challenge Collaborative website, and that email web address will be on the last slide. Most of those materials were created for round 1, but because we believe that the final guidelines aren't going to be hugely different, we think those materials will help you now as well in preparing for round 3, and then we'll update them as soon as the guidelines come out, which we believe will be, any day now. And obviously, as those guidelines come out, we'll be preparing other calls so that we can discuss what the changes in the guidelines mean and might mean for each of your decisions. So please look at the Early Learning Challenge Collaborative website and take advantage of any support that you think might be helpful to you, either from the Early Learning Challenge Collaborative or other groups that might be able to support your efforts. On the logistics front, all of you except the presenters are muted. We'll offer you a number of chances during the webinar to ask questions out loud. At that time, if you have a question, you can press *7, and that will unmute your line. And presenters can mute themselves when they're not speaking by pressing *6, which will reduce the background noise. Also, you can virtually raise your hand. You can do this by clicking the Raise Hand button, which is on the top left of the conference window. That'll let us know that you want to be called on, and then when you are called on, you just press *7 to unmute your line. The Raise Hand button is a toggle, so when you want to put your hand down, you just click the same button. We'll also, another way that the webinar will be interactive, although less real-time interaction, is that many of you sent in questions and concerns that you have about the application, about the planning, about the, wanting to hear from round 1 and round 2 grantees, things that your state is grappling with now. And we've taken those questions to heart both in the preparation of the slides and in terms of the commentary that the presenters will make. Last, you can write new questions that come to mind as people are speaking in the chat box. And although we might not drop everything and answer them that second, we'll read those questions, and when it's appropriate, we'll make sure that one or more of the presenters applies to that question. At the end of the webinar, the materials will all be posted on the Early Learning Challenge Collaborative and BUILD websites, and we'll also email the PowerPoint to each of you that registered for the webinar. So the webinar is about a closer to 2020 hindsight that grant writers, state leaders, and grant implementers now have about round 1 and round 2 Early Learning Challenge grants. And it's a chance for them to share with you, potential round 3 applicants, what they've learned and what they're wishing they had known when they first wrote their grant application. So we hope it's helpful. Right before we start, I just want to thank each of the presenters for sharing this information with you, and each of you for joining the call. I want to start by kicking it over to Sherri Killins. She's the former commissioner of the Department of Early Education and Care in Massachusetts. She's now a consultant with BUILD, the Early Learning Challenge Collaborative, and many other groups. But today she'll be drawing on her experience as a successful applicant for the Early Learning Challenge Grant in Round 1 in Massachusetts. So Sherri?
Thank you, Susan. And again, welcome everyone to the session. We are really excited, and we want this to be as interactive as possible. Susan's given you multiple ways using the chat box. We've read the questions that you've given us, or raising your hand, and we'll even take a couple pauses in the presentation if you want to unmute yourself and ask a question. We really want this to be beneficial to you. I also want to thank the co-presenters today. You will see each of their pictures right before they present, but we have William Browning, who's written several federal applications, including an Early Learning Challenge and a district Race to the Top application. We have Harriet Dichter, who's worked in the early learning space, both nationally as well as Delaware and Pennsylvania. We have Kelly Maxwell, who's worked at Franklin Porter Graham and now Child Trends, and been deeply involved in North Carolina's management of the grant. And we have Theresa Hawley, who supported the writing of the Illinois grant and now is in the role of implementer. So I think there are not many questions we can't answer. What we hope, though, is that we may disagree at points because of the chairs we sit in or the roles that we held, and you're going to experience that in your state as well. So at points, I'll raise questions with the presenters so that you can hear multiple points of view based on where they sit in the work. So we want to review the purpose and frame of the 2011 Race to the Top Early Learning Challenge Grant. As Susan said, we don't expect much to be different, but if you read the for comment notice, there are some minor things that might be different. We want to provide an opportunity for you to hear these multiple points of view from a grant writer, from a state leader, from someone who's helping manage a grant. And we also want to share with you what we view to be key lessons learned in our planning and design for the 2011 applications. The Early Learning Challenge Grant goal is a big one, really focusing deeply on children birth to 5 and their early learning, and really measuring that by making sure that children enter kindergarten with the skills, knowledge, dispositions they need in order to be successful. I want to remind you that at least the previous application was divided in these 5 big buckets: establishing successful state systems, defining high quality and accountable programs, promoting early learning and development outcomes for children, supporting a great early childhood education workforce, and measuring outcomes and progress. And as we speak to you today, we'll begin with some overall comments and thoughts that each person brings, and then we will have a conversation in each of those about each of those sections, ending with some broader-based concerns around staffing and budgeting and the like. It's still a great opportunity. It really elevates the basis for public investment. It's a comprehensive approach. It looks at all the domains of learning of young children. It focuses on and addresses high-needs children, or those children that are most vulnerable. It builds a bridge and attempts to align the work between birth to 5 and K-12 and higher education, as our adults who are working with young children are often educated through our higher education system. And it seeks to really build and support an essential infrastructure that's sustainable. The first person you'll hear from will be William Browning, who supported the Colorado application. William? Star 6 to unmute.
Star 7 to unmute.
I'm showing off my credibility by being unable to mute the line. I apologize.
But you're a great writer.
That's correct. Thank you so much for the introduction. I'm just going to make some key points to this presentation, and I tend to get very excited and speak quickly, so I'll apologize in advance. But I may have a little different view than some people But I want to start by just talking about the reality here. And one of the key realities is that if you're a state that hasn't done Race to the Top, the key issue here is that this is a major undertaking. And as much as you want to have the kumbaya, wide and deep stakeholder engagement and letters of support from every faction within your state, the reality is that in order to produce a grant that's going to win, you really want to make sure you're streamlining consensus building and making sure that you've got a good production team. You're getting a sufficient level of engagement, but you're not creating your own internal bureaucracy and impasse as far as building and produce. Bullet point 2 is really critical to us, is that we've had Race to the Top has been good for a lot of ego correction, so to speak. You're competing against lots of other states. I always assume that you're not. There's no guarantees with Race to the Top. You really want to strive to make sure that you are almost think of yourself at the bottom, really looking at challenging your ego. Time is an issue from start to finish. Once this, before the guidance is even released, it really should be critical to have your project plan done before, knowing exactly week by week what your play card looks like, who's going to be where and when, so to speak. The last 2 bullet points relate together. And this is sometimes, Race to the Top grants are run by a part-time person with as a part-time job. These are really, the leadership of the state is really critical of somebody who really is buckled in for the grant from start to finish. You can certainly contract part of that, but at the end of the day, it's going to be a state leader who is dedicated, committed, and should be a full sponsor. And I really believe it's a role that's 100% committed, given the velocity and the sheer complexity of managing the grant and what it means from a state impact. These are my critical kind of setup points for managing the grant.
Thank you, William. Harriet, many of us as state leaders have to deal with multiple stakeholders, and I know later in the presentation you talk about some of the stakeholders you got involved in the process. But from your perspective, how do you manage this thing about managing stakeholders in response to a grant process, but then recognizing you're a state leader who needs stakeholders for the long haul?
Well, I think that as people are going through this, it is a balancing act, but in the end, the application is going to call upon states to demonstrate stakeholder commitment and buy into the process. And to me, this is a good opportunity to use the planning period, although it's a hasty planning period, to really touch base with key stakeholders. Can
you speak up a little bit louder,
yes,
folks?
Can people hear okay?
Yeah, that's better.
And key constituents. So from where I sit, we have to maximize the opportunity here and try to take advantage of existing forums, existing relationships to try to get people on board. It's both critical in terms of the scoring of the application, and it becomes, of course, extremely critical during implementation as well. So that a deliberative process with the range of stakeholders is a portion of what people will need to be working on during the application period.
Thanks. And that really goes into this next slide, which I'm just using as an overview, that in regard to state politics, and most politics are really local, know your own context, be able to shape your argument and message. And I know that's one of the questions that came from participants. How do you message this work? How do you message this grant in the context of the other things you're doing? And then make sure you really have a strategy around the governor's office, the broader early childhood community, and your state organization partners. And I know, William, you have some lessons learned from your work in Colorado.
Yeah, so one, I think one of those partners has to be the business community. One of the ways that you can convince some of the conservative resistance about federal entitlement or federal grants, taking money from the federal government, is to really look at the business case. So I'm a business person. The coalition we built in Colorado was successful because we were able to build in strong business leaders who understood that workforce readiness, this is not just about kindergarten readiness, it's about building and investing in the workforce of the future. And states that are having issues with governors or people who are really resistant to taking federal money or for whatever reason, you really can frame it from a business perspective on a return on investment talk. And again, it's about reducing long-term costs. It's about reducing K-12 remediation, college mediation rates. You want to build higher quality ECE, or do you want to build higher quality? We were able to get that story pretty well cemented early on. If you have a governor that's obviously resistant, you need to resolve that problem immediately, because you don't want to be 5 weeks into producing a grant and have your governor refuse to sign it, which I know has happened in other grant methodology, so to speak. And I would again, we talk about the context, the state context. I would look at knowing your political alignment and making sure it's not just state people advocating for improving early childhood, but again, those business leaders and other elements of the community that really are influential, and knowing who those influencers are and how to leverage them. And that's about building coalitions and getting them to really carry support. So it's not really you asking the governor for his support or your state leadership. It's the power advocates and people in the community that have that kind of leverage. And I would also, the last bullet point's a really minor one. In concurrent with a strong business case, you really outline sustainability and financial integrity. Easy way to diffuse any kind of discussion on mismanaging money or so forth is to demonstrate how you're really clearly going to make sure that you're going to get to that business case by having good controls, ensuring that local entities are well funded. That there's lots of ways to ensure that the money is helping empower the system for systemic change, but it's also sustainable. And from a business person, if you're a conservative and you're a business person, you can really get those values and get behind them, because it really is like making a capital investment for your business.
Thanks. Kelly, in North Carolina, how did you deal with these issues of state politics?
Well, I think the lesson North Carolina has to share is to suggest that you not only have to think about your current politics and the current political context and making sure that everybody is supportive of your grant application, but I also think you need to think about possible changes in political leadership. So, for example, if your state's governor is going to be running for re-election in the next year or so, I think states need to also think about that, and that may affect some of the things they put in their application in order to be successful long term.
Thank you. William, you talked about building high-quality plans, which are really the foundation of the application, and you did this great drawing that shows how it connects.
Well, I'm not sure it's a great drawing, but it's certainly one that is simple. But thank you. I'm a big believer that the goals drive high-quality planning. If you know what you want to achieve from a performance measure or from an objective, you're able to put an implementation plan that has detail around that. And then that will determine where you need to put your financial assets. And then you can tell the story. Some people work the other way around. They tell the story, and then they build their plan, and then they get to the money. But then what happens is that the money discussions are interesting because you always have some adjustments and corrections. And so the faster you can get your high-quality plan and your budgeting tied together, the faster that happens, the more clearly you can ensure that your story is not going to drive systemic change in your plan. So it means that you're suddenly $500,000 short because you didn't calculate for indirect costs. You're not changing your narrative, if that makes sense. So getting the HQP and money tied tight. And one trick we had that was interesting is instead of working ground-up budgeting, we bucketed out. We basically said, hey, QRIS, your budget's $12.5 million. Workforce, you've got $5 million. And that was interesting because it allowed, instead of doing bottom-up budgeting and really having that kind of chaotic, okay, we still have $100,000 here, here, and here to play with. It reduced all that because the assurance area leaders were able to know what they had, how they were supposed to budget it, and at the end of the day, it really came out a lot cleaner. And that was an interesting way to do it. I've done the bottom-up, and that can tend to be a little heavy sometimes and a little more error-prone.
Thank you. Harriet, do you have thoughts on high-quality plans? I know we're going to get to later with Kelly, talking about the evidence and making sure these are plans that have a chance of also being successful. But one question the group has is, do you build new high-quality plans, or are you building off something that the state was already doing and you're really doing an expansion strategy?
I think, again, that's a state context question. If you have something that has been part of your previous strategic planning and you have a clear go-forward direction with good evidence behind it, then I think it's feasible and possible to use that to develop your high-quality plan. So that's an area I'd really urge states to go back and sort of see what has been the strategic planning framework. Does the state have a current plan where you've actually been able to get good stakeholder buy-in and consensus, and then can you use that to drive the work forward? If your plan of where you thought you were heading is contradictory, of course, to the principles or the vision of the challenge, then it's not going to serve you well to continue to use that plan. But if that plan is really consistent with the direction and the systems building focus for this grant, then there's probably some merit to be gained from referencing that and from being able to use that in a go-forward mode.
Thank you. And Kelly, a question came up about does the state have to have an indirect rate already? And another question regarding not understanding the way William described the budgeting, but not understanding the other option he presented. But how did you do your budget, Kelly, as the manager in North Carolina?
Well, we did not follow William's advice. So I think that this is good to hear. Kind of, I agree that there are some ideal ways you might approach this, but in your own state, you're going to have to go with however it rolls out and works in your own state. So for us, in terms of budgeting, we spent more time thinking about the projects and the portfolio of projects we were going to have, and we really did do the bottom-up budgeting then. As people were developing their ideas for projects, they were working on budgets, and then we put the pieces together. So we went a different approach and did not assign dollar figures to certain projects or certain sections of the grant.
Okay, thank you. And just to answer the indirect question, it's my experience, most states have an indirect cost set up with the federal government, and yes, that's the one you use, but it's managed after the application. So if you've given them the wrong indirect number in the application, it'll be adjusted once you're a winner.
Sherri, can I weigh in here as well, because it's not it's a state choice whether to claim indirect as well on this grant. And so I just want to point that out to people. Delaware, for example, we made a decision not to make indirect claims on the grant or to permit them with some of our state agency partners. So there are different perspectives you can take on that. And that may be something people want to take into consideration in their planning in terms of resource allocation.
Yeah, but just to be, I don't understand. Why would a state not want to take indirect? What's the benefit?
Well, we decided that we would rather allocate monies as close as possible to the service sector, and therefore to not use any indirect charges in terms of state claiming.
So that's almost your in-kind.
In-kind.
It could be argued as an in-kind in the application and as an evidence of commitment. And certainly for states that might be having difficulty demonstrating consistent expenditures over the past couple of years, it could potentially be part of the case to show state commitment.
Thank you both. Theresa, welcome, and we want to start with talking about your approach to the work.
So our approach was largely driven by the fact that the grant had been set up with these the scoring criteria really talking about you having your work either not implemented or partially implemented, substantially or fully implemented, and the points for each section being allocated according to those criteria. So when the grant application first came out in the summer of 2011 and we looked at the things that were going to be included in it, and we knew that Race the Top tends to allocate their points this way, we took a look at it and said, good Lord, there's a lot of things that we don't have in place already, and in just saying that we're going to do them is probably not going to win us this grant. We're going to have to get some stuff in place right away. So we spent a lot of time in our round 1 application, not just on writing the application or developing our high quality plan for the future, but doing the work in a very hurried way, getting something together so that we had something that we could say was at least partially or substantially implemented. I would not recommend that to anyone. That's a hellish way to try to go about doing a grant. And also I'm not sure that it had the level of payoff that we would have hoped. We didn't get a lot of the people agreeing with us that we were substantially implemented in some of these things that we were trying to make that case. Hopefully for people who are applying now in round 3, you've had a couple of years of clarity about what it is that are the things that you need to have in place and be talking about in your plan, and have been able to put some of those things in place in your state, at least to some extent, so that you'll be able to show your partial or full implementation or what have you. But for us, that was not the case. So we spent a lot of time working on the substance of the grant and doing it in a very compressed time frame some of what under more ordinary circumstances would be the first year of your grant implementation. So for example, the criteria for a cross-sector quality rating and improvement system, we put that together in a matter of 6 weeks in our state. We had a quality rating and improvement system, but not one that included part-day settings, which were, we have a very large state preschool program. So it didn't include that state preschool program or for the most part Head Start. So we completely revamped all of the criteria for our QRIS in a matter of 6 weeks, which I really don't recommend, and I don't think gave us the quality of a plan that we would want to have. We had the luxury of being a phase 2 state, or round 2 state, so when we redid our application, we had that whole other year of time to develop a much better and reasonable plan for that cross-sector QRIS that we're now putting in place. So same thing with our kindergarten assessment. We were already at the point where we were planning to release an RFP for that later in 2011, but we moved that forward so that we had it out the door before our application went in, so that we could argue that we were substantially implemented on the KEA. We didn't win on that. Too many of the reviewers didn't buy that argument. And we also revised all of our early learning standards in a matter of 6 weeks because we wanted to bring them up to date. So we spent a lot of our time and energy on that work, which was a great burst of energy in our state and a great burst of attention all at the same time, but that's a lot to try to take on. Just the writing of the grant itself is really quite enough. We also have very heavy involvement from our Early Learning Council Executive Committee. We met with them on probably like a every 10 days basis throughout the entire planning of the grant, bringing them along with every decision that we were making as we put together the grant application. That was not easy, and as one of the key grant writers, I was only ever really able to write on nights and weekends, which again I don't recommend to people, but it did serve us well as we went to implement the grant that we had that level of heavy involvement.
Thank you. And I think you make 2 good points, that this grant is about building, and you wouldn't recommend the way you did it, but looking for things that are going on in the state that you're scaling up or scaling out is critical, and the critical importance of keeping the stakeholders involved. Kelly is now going to present her first slide really about performance measures and the points. Sorry, Kelly.
All right, go back. There you go. I think I want to start by saying that when we were working on our application, the Early Learning Challenge Collaborative had put together a panel of folks to talk about lessons learned from the K-12 Race to the Top that might apply for Early Learning Challenge. And I vividly remember laughing at one presenter who just kept saying his advice was, read the selection criteria, read the points, understand how your points are awarded, have a meeting with all of your grant writing team and leaders, review it all together, discuss it, over and over. And he would go on and talk about other things, and then he would come back and repeat that. And we laughed and said, okay, yeah, we get that. Having lived through that, I really want to reiterate that again, because I think this is so important that you have multiple people in this process understand the points and the scoring system, and then play the police role, because when you're having a general conversation about what do you need to do to strengthen your system and move forward in these areas, you're going to have a lot of fabulous ideas. I think the trick is you need to figure out which fabulous ideas are going to get you the most points in this particular application, and somebody needs to be able to say, that's a great idea, but it's not really well aligned with this application, so we need to figure out another way to get that funding, but it can't go in this one. Related to that is linking your high-quality plans to the performance measures. In the application, I'm expecting that the performance measures will be the same, and the performance measures include your baseline information about where you are, for example, in terms of the number of programs that are participating in your TQRIS, the number of programs of the upper tiers, the proportion of children with high needs who are being served in high-quality programs. Those kinds of things are in your performance measures. You'll have to set targets for moving the needle on those performance measures for each year that you're funded through the grant. I think the trick is you need to figure out what you're going to do that's going to help support your movement on those performance measures. The other point I want to say is that if the scoring is like it was in 2011, you're going to get points for both what you've done previously and what you're planning to do. So really don't underestimate the importance of talking about what you have done, and then describing how what you have done really lays the groundwork for your future plans. And then the last point about performance measures, at least in the 2011 application, the catchphrase was ambitious yet achievable performance measures. So your trick is to balance. You want to be sure that people would agree that they're ambitious, and then because you're going to be held accountable for them, you really do want to be sure they're achievable. So this is just to reiterate that once you get the grant, it really is true. You're going to have to report on performance measures every year, and they are going to hold you accountable for them. So I would say take the time to carefully set your targets and really have somebody who takes the lead in thinking through those performance measures with the core leadership team to set your targets so that everybody agrees that, yes, they're ambitious, but they're also achievable. And then my final point about points in the application is just a simple thing about organizing the application and using headings and writing in such a way that you make it as easy as possible for the reviewer to follow what it is you're saying, how that matches up with the scoring criteria, and to easily see that you've met the points. So I think the trick is to be very clear and as succinct as possible in the application.
Thank you. Now, moving on, thinking about the application is divided into an A through E sections, and so we're going to walk through each section. This goes to Kelly's last point about the points. Before I show you each section, we're showing you what the points were that were available in 2011. We don't have any assurance that'll be the case in 2013. But there were these 4 sections that were able to receive points in Section A. And then William, you want to talk about lessons about state systems.
You bet. These may sound pretty elementary, but they're coming from what we learned in Colorado. One, obviously, is producing, and you can do this concurrently with your HQPs, but starting to build your executive summary, your compelling narrative on the front end, especially with A2 and your overarching vision for what you want to do with the Race to the Top grant. I think emphasizing the previous point that you're ambitious yet achievable, you're accountable and sustainable, and that you're really focusing on a sense of commitment in the governance structure. I mean, what I mean there is that a lot of times people over-elaborate their governance structure, but knowing that you have a team and a governance position in place to really execute the grant well, I think is a very compelling piece. Obviously, a big selling point here is going to be all of you have probably made significant progress despite not receiving round one or round two federal funds. And I think you need to really emphasize the ability that you have made in your state to improve your quality and make sure that's fused in, that when you're talking about past commitments and A1, that you really have demonstrated without the federal funding a clear movement. We just talked about performance measures. I thought that was an excellent advice on performance measures, but really having a very clear articulation of those goals. And then I really recommend a summary set of summary graphics or tables that really clearly tie it all together and show where your investments are being made and how they're tied to the plan. And then last bullet point, and maybe because we are a local controlled state here in Colorado, but the emphasis obviously on local council, local engagement, and really making sure that it's not just a top-down, top-driven mandate from the state, but really inclusion. And this is where your stakeholder engagement piece really should happen, which is in terms if you have really local council or childhood local councils or people on the ground, providers, institutions of higher learning, you really have an engaged strategy for, it's a statewide strategy. It's not purely just the Office of Early Childhood strategy. And then last but not least, focusing on really effective PR campaigns really dedicated toward engaging and informing families. That has been a segment of every Race to Top grant I've seen, is that question of how are you ensuring you're informing the high needs families about the opportunities in the grant, and as well as providers and other partners. And then last but not least, on the sustainability, that you can showcase that you indeed have a grant that you're investing in one-time investments that are really infrastructural and long-term, and that's sustainable beyond the year 4 of the grant.
Thank you. And you've heard from Harriet a couple of times, who's now in Delaware and had worked in Pennsylvania. Welcome, Harriet.
Thank you, Sherri. So I have a couple of slides I'm going to try to run through to help people situate some of the section on the state system and where you're heading. And this first slide is really the reminder that the whole concept behind the challenge is around systems building. And this particular slide shows a perspective on systems building. One of the things that I think we saw across the successful applications is that many of them took the time to articulate some sort of systems vision and to actually kind of focus that and center that right in the application itself. So this particular chart is a particular take on a systems approach that could be used. And then, Sherri, if we could move to the next slide. In this next slide, basically, one of the big issues that you see in the systems section and then in the remaining sections really has to do with partners and who needs to be at the table. And there's virtually no state, even states with consolidated governance models, who still have 100% of the partners contained in one agency. And so here I've tried to give people, just using Delaware as an example, the kinds of partners that actually had to be at the table and have a role during not only planning but actually in the investment side and carrying out the activities, to try to remind us that we have a lot of collaborative and partnership opportunities that are part of the systems building approach. So using Delaware as the example, you can see that there are several state agencies who have significant roles, people who are involved with child care assistance and child care subsidy, the public health and maternal and child health partners, Medicaid, child care licensing, child protective services, Department of Education, both for early learning focus within there, and then assessment accountability and other people working on the K-12 side of the occasion, and finally the governor's office. So that's kind of a reminder. It happens in Delaware that all of those state partners are actually active implementers. So not only were they endorsers of the work, but an effort was made to find and distribute resources and try to set up some additional strategies for people to be able to work across agency lines in terms of the child outcomes people were trying to influence. Stakeholder-wise, I think people have talked about this already, that the Early Childhood Council is a big opportunity. In Delaware, actually, the council was able to be leveraged and new committees were formed with a new strategic plan that really more closely mirrors the setup of the challenge so that there would be better synchronicity going into the work and then an execution so that things really could all be prioritized in the same way. Another example, again, in Delaware in partnership, and I think William already mentioned this for Colorado, is the opportunity for engagement of business partners. Delaware, that's the Business Roundtable as an important stakeholder voice. And actually, I'll talk about this later, important to sustainability. And then, of course, I think important here, and there's some stuff, at least in the old guidance, around clarity around the community partners. These are both your backbone organizations in the early childhood, education, health, and human services communities, as well as the actual organizations who are working directly with children and their families. So that's one important aspect of the state systems work. This is a great opportunity to actually broaden out the level of focus, prioritization, and ownership of these issues across the state.
That's how I viewed it in my work in Massachusetts. Is we actually distributed resources. I called it giving those state agencies a child development lens. I don't know, Theresa, one of the questions we got in is, did your child care development block grant, taking that as an example of federal funds, did they specifically do something different as a result of Race to the Top?
So we, in Illinois, we built upon a lot of the ways that we were already using our child development block grant funding, our quality funds in particular. We built upon the systems that had already been created through the CCDF money to go deeper into quality enhancement and strategies around the QRIS and all of that. But we recognize that we need to take the opportunity of the next several years as we're developing and implementing our Early Learning Challenge grant to really look at how we're spending all of the resources. One of the things that I say constantly as we bring our Early Learning Council together is that for our state, the $52 million that we ended up getting with the Race to the Top grant over 4 years comes out to being somewhere around 2 to 3% of our annual expenditures on early care and education in our state. So, and I always say that the grant is a failure if all we do is spend the $52 million well. What it really needs to be about is helping us leverage and understand how we're going to change the way that we're spending the other 98% of the money, and changing the way we're spending the $1 billion a year, which is a much harder question than just how to spend this money well. So we're working on that in our state. I think we're taking the process of, hey, we got to at least get the grant started to be implemented in this first year, but we're at that point in our state to really now be thinking about how do we want to look at our various funding streams differently in our state to push forward the level of change that we want to see in terms of program development and outcomes.
Thank you. And Harriet, as you do the next slide, a couple questions came in. One is, so where's higher ed in your partners? I know in Massachusetts they were a part of the Education Secretariat, so they were equal to early education in K to 12. And another question about, well, did you get letters from the business community? What did they say?
Sure, I'm happy to address both of those. I tried pretty incompetently to put that on chat. Business community, the answer was yes, got letters of support, and we have an actual business engagement strategy in the challenge and are using resources for that as part of the sustainability work. And then in addition on higher ed, they are a key partner, and we have a whole strategy that is centered on working with higher ed in the implementation phase for Delaware and the challenge. So this next chart, which can be a little bit challenging to read, but I do understand Susan is going to send people the PowerPoint so you'll be able to see it more clearly, is actually how we reframed the work that's being done under the challenge for implementation. And it's here mostly to illustrate one of the points that I think we've been trying to make about your application focus and application planning, which is you have to be able to tell a story. And you have to help people who are not necessarily as deeply enmeshed in understanding the particularities in your state to be able to see what's happening. So this particular chart actually takes the buckets that were used in the challenge and it rebuckets them into 4 big goals. Those 4 big goals, one centers on health, the second centers on quality early childhood education through the QRIS, the third centers on connections between birth to 5 and into K-12 and higher ed, and the fourth centers on sustainability and includes any of the work that is data or research related and all of the community engagement and leadership work that is necessary for sustainability. So this chart has actually been a very helpful way to be able to communicate to people who are not in the weeds what's happening without them knowing every detail. The last points that I want to make around successful state systems I think have been foreshadowed by things the other presenters have said. This section is very important because it's an introductory section for your reader, and they will need to feel confident as they are finishing the section that you know where you've been and that you know where you're heading. And so this gives you the opportunity to give you a clear storyline. It allows you to make choices around your narrative because what you're trying to aim for here is something that seems inevitable. The investment of the federal money seems like an of course or a must for the state because where you're heading is inevitable. And the last thing I want to say here is in this section, many of the states failed to take advantage of the opportunity to talk about sustainability. This is pretty critical. There are not many federal grants that actually allow you to spend resources to have a plan and to execute on it. So this is something I'd urge people to really focus on, and in this section to really think about your data, your research, your community engagement, as well as good program design and implementation fit into opportunities for sustainability over time.
Thank you. And closing this section, Theresa, you had some thoughts just about your context as you came into thinking about your state system.
Right. So, I mean, I think that coming into the Early Learning Challenge grant, Illinois clearly has long been a strong state for early childhood and with a lot of support for early childhood. But man, when the Early Learning Challenge grant came out, it was clear that it wasn't written based on how Illinois had been developing its early childhood system. So we really were not seen as an odds-on favorite for getting the race to the top because we had a lot of struggles. And so I want to just encourage other states out there that are maybe in a similar situation where you've been doing a lot in early childhood and you have a lot to show, but this grant is not necessarily set up in a way that shows off your strengths. So as I had mentioned before, we had a QRS that only had about a 20% participation rate among child care, and it didn't have preschool for all programs that were mostly in schools already included. We, like pretty much everywhere else, had rampant mistrust across sectors in early childhood, across child care versus school-based preschool for all and all of that. And we, governance-wise, we had just implemented a Governor's Office of Early Childhood Development. So we're in the nascent stages of having real governance to go across all of this kind of stuff. We did have that long history of commitment in our state, and that we had a very engaged Early Learning Council, and we drew upon all of that. And I think that, like I talked about before, we did a lot of rushing around to try to fill in the holes that we had, and I'm not sure that that was our best way to go about it. I think that creating really good, high-quality plans and laying out, making your best case for what you have been doing in your state, and then just laying out the ways that you're going to plan and move forward that are consistent with the criteria of the grant is a good way to go.
And Theresa, I just wonder, and it's not for an answer, if doing that work of creating actual products around your early learning standards, around QRIS, while felt rushed to you in the state, was a part of building the cohesiveness to address some of your challenges.
It certainly was the having that kind of deadline and having that we have to get this done allowed us to get things done that might never have gotten done in our state. So yes, I think without absent this early learning challenge, there's pretty much I can't imagine a scenario in which we would have created a cross-sector quality rating and improvement system in our state.
Having said that, it was hard to do in the period of time.
And we found that we had to go back and redo it because it wasn't, and so maybe that's the balance of being able to put in your high quality plan like, hey, we were able to come to this level of consensus, and here's our plan for how we're going to revisit some of these issues as we move forward.
Got it. If you have questions about Section A as we've gone through, please feel free to use the chat room or raise your hand, and we'll get to you so that we can get through the whole presentation, because I don't see any hands raised right this second. I'm going to keep going, but please raise your hand if you've got a question, and we will bring that in. So going into the second section, which was high quality accountable programs, again there was a scoring, and you had to respond to each of the sections, and we're going to start with William.
Yeah, hello again. So TQRIS is the best part of the grant. The most fun you'll ever have is looking at TQRIS. I'm just kidding. Clearly, this one has the highest degree, in my opinion, of complexity. Section D, workforce, probably right up there. But this one in particular, 5 subsections of really pretty specific questions about how are you ensuring that you're providing, like Colorado, we labeled it as the next generation TQRIS system, meaning that we really focused on integration between our traditional licensing system and the rating strategy to increase from our current number of providers that are we have QualiStar here in Colorado, QualiStar rated, and tying that into the licensing capability. So we really put together, I thought, a pretty clear strategy on how we were going to do this. One thing we did do differently in round 2 than round 1 is that we actually built in some pretty significant design time. So instead of telling the feds that we have the definitive answer and total clarity on how the rating system would work and how this would be designed, we actually built in a design stage for about 9 months of our year 1 grant. And this was helpful because we didn't want to put ourselves out into the wilderness by locking ourselves into a design that we felt that would be difficult to implement. And thankfully, the feds were able to do that. But I think it's important that you can build in those clear design deliverables inside your program plan. That one will give you better confidence and ability to implement it, but also give the feds a clear view of ambitious yet achievable. We really need to be clear on how you're going to build your evaluation strategy. Evaluation is one of those key tenets. The good news is with evaluation, I think the states that are applying this round, I think, have some advantages that round 1 did not have. There's some really good work happening around how to effectively build evaluation strategy. So I would encourage states to leverage those technical systems assets and ask the round 1, round 2 states what they're doing. Clearly that there's some advantage there. I think we really focused on Colorado on making sure that the high need access that for high needs families was a priority. While we bundled a lot of our communication, we consolidated most of our communication under the governance section under Section A. We did build a lot of mechanisms for engaging local councils, providers, the community engagement platform here inside of the TQRIS section. We also did some innovative approaches around shared services and looking at models that would allow us to have a higher sustainability as far as ensuring high quality programs. We did tie in, we did not respond to the data section specifically in the grant, but we did build in a pretty comprehensive early childhood data system narrative inside of TQRIS, because we realized that a lot of our data systems and alignment of data strategy was pretty clear, easy to do inside of TQRIS because you're already talking about some pretty core systems. And we were able to look at how to build that data system strategy, and with that, put a pretty clear narrative around access, meaning that it's not just getting data, a good data platform, but ensuring that families have access to the data across the state. And then we put a lot of money into incentives and other types of vehicles that would allow providers, particularly, to be able to adopt to the newer, higher rating strategy. So, and the good news about incentives is that you don't have to put a huge amount, at least we didn't, you have to put a huge amount of detail about the mechanics of those incentives. We have a lot of design language in around how the incentives would work, and then we distribute them locally from years 2 to 4. So for us, TQRIS, we were really able to boil it down into some really basic buckets, and then from a high-quality plan, really focus on the core themes. And for us in TQRIS, it was the integration next generation. It was access. It was ensuring that we had a very clear step-by-step program to design the next generation, and then really looking at creative ways to incentivize and ensure that people were informed and well engaged about the development process.
Thank you. And Harriet, what's the Delaware story?
So I'm not going to go into quite as much detail as what was provided about Colorado, which I think should be very helpful and illustrative to people. A couple of things I wanted to note was looking around the states is that people need to have good clarity about the strategies and rationale for the cross-sector or the full menu of the early learning programs. Theresa also talked quite a bit about this for Illinois, but this turned out to have been an area of concern for many reviewers about what was going on there. It is really important in the application to take seriously the federal language on children with high needs, and to make sure that you have that as a purposeful focus that is different from just building a QRIS in general. And it relates to sections, at least in the old application, where people really were looking and were giving points or taking them away around supply building issues in child care. And then the other 2 points really to make here is that this issue of how people who are newer to QRIS are going to think thoughtfully about enrollment and outreach for enrollment into the QRIS, and the progression through the tiers is critical. Kelly talked about the fact that what you put in the performance tables you will be accountable for. And so those tables, whether you shouldn't think of them as an academic exercise, they really relate to your overall strategy in this area. So I think those would be my big sort of pieces to add in addition to what Kelly's going to talk about next, which is the validation and evaluation of this.
Thank you. And Kelly, we've learned so much more about validation now.
We have. So I do feel like this is a clear area where folks writing the application this time have a big advantage to what we were at in 2011, because I think because of the requirement to validate your TQRIS in such a way that you demonstrated that the ratings meaningfully differentiated programs in quality and the ratings were related to children's outcomes, really fostered several and ongoing conversations about validation and what do we really need. So I wanted to highlight 3 resources that if I were working on an application right now, I would be wanting to be sure I had somebody on my team who understood those and could use that to help craft the validation section, assuming that that's going to be part of the application again. The first one is key elements of a QRIS validation plan. I should say all of these have been developed with funding from the Office of Planning, Research, and Evaluation in the federal government. And the first template for a validation plan was in large part designed to help early learning states think through their validation plan. So although all of us had to write something in our application, after we were awarded the grant, the federal team came back to all of the states and said, spend a little more time thinking about QRIS validation and send us a plan, a little more detailed plan about how you want to address validating your TQRIS. And so in North Carolina, I will say, we've proposed a 2-phase plan.
because North Carolina is a state that's had a QRIS for several years. So we had, before the application, started the process of thinking about where are we headed in the next decade. What, if we were going to revise our QRIS, what would it look like? And so we proposed the first phase of validation to help us gather data to figure out what the revised QRIS would look like, and then proposed later doing a second validation that would address the more specific questions in the application about the relationship between the ratings and children's outcomes. So I would highly encourage you to look at the validation plan. I think the QRIS Learning Network probably has all three of these on here, but if you Google these with the titles, they will also pop up. The second middle light blue one with a teacher sitting in front of a small group of children is a brief about QRIS validation. So it's a good starting piece about what do we mean by validation. We typically think about 4 aspects of validation and when's the right time to think about all of those, and some definitions and some thoughts about what goes into each kind of component of a validation study. And then the third resource is broader than validation. It's really focused, it's a toolkit for QRIS evaluation. That has really a wealth of information in it about thinking about evaluating QRIS, including things like if you need to develop an RFP for an evaluator, what are some of the kinds of things you should be thinking about. So I think more so than looking at first round applications in terms of what was put in applications for QRIS validation, I think states would be much better off looking at these resources and learning from the lessons we've learned since 2011 about validation.
Thank you. The next section, promoting early learning outcomes, you were able to pick optional. I'm not sure the maximum points are correct as I'm reading this right now, but you were able to pick 2 of these if you wanted. We're going to start with Delaware's approach.
So this particular slide is actually from the grant application, just so people are aware. And it shows the effort to try to take advantage of some of the family engagement and the cross-sector issues here on whole child health and development. And so if you take a look across the bottom of this, this really shows you some of the interventions. Those are also in that earlier slide, which I showed you bucket 1. So Delaware really elected to focus pretty heavily on the family engagement aspect of this and on the connections into overall health and development. There are a lot of choice points to be made in this section, but these are, again, good leverage points in terms of the system building and being able to create one way or another very strong and robust understanding that the early childhood development aspect of the challenge is really on par with this focus within the QRIS.
Thank you. And next one?
Yes, and so I think this is really a repeat here. You know, this is in this section again. These are really nice opportunities for partnership. For the feds, as many of you know, did not define home visiting as a mandatory early education program. But this is a clear place where you can build out your strategy more successfully and more thoughtfully into work going on in your communities and try to create a better continuum with your home visiting programs.
Thank you. The next section is early childhood workforce and measuring progress and outcomes. Again, there were points available. You could respond to one or both sections, and we're going to start with William.
Hey there. So the first time we did, the first round we did workforce, I think we had people ready to jump out of the windows because we overcomplicated the section. I love my peers' advice earlier in the conversation. If you take nothing else away from this conversation, take away the point that really focus on what the feds are asking for and the language they're asking for it and the points associated. And this section in particular, we really looked at boiling this down to the simplest level of response around D1 really being about the competencies and the framework and setting up that discussion, and then 2 really looking at how you actually disseminate, incentivize, and build scholarships and programs to get the workforce up to quality. We really looked at the ability to empower people through professional scholarships and then tying that to our registry. If you haven't looked at the National Registry Alliance, which our NRA, not the rifle one, but the registry acronym, the NRA has some pretty significant resources around ensuring your workforce registry component or professional development information system, however you want to call it, structure. This is really a pretty critical component of the grant. Round 1, a lot of states got hammered for not having a registry. The good news is, again, because states are, it's now 2 years later, there are some fantastic resources about workforce registry and learning management systems that really can help tell a compelling story. But again, the biggest lesson we learned in this one from round 1 to 2 was to simplify it. Really, people involved, especially in higher ed and human resource development, tend to speak a very different language. So sometimes you're having those people write this section, while it seems like it's a good idea at first as far as getting their expertise, we discovered that they sometimes over-sophisticate or put too much complexity into the grant. So I'd be cautious here to really get to the bottom line of what you're trying to do, which is build a framework for how you're measuring and setting the goal, the standards for your workforce, and then D2 is all about, okay, how do we get those people informed, engaged, and up to that level.
Thank you. And Delaware?
So it's interesting. I agree with William's point, having looked at many of these applications, that people tended to make this section overly complex and used a lot of jargon that actually I think reviewers got confused by. Delaware didn't actually have this problem in its application. In fact, its IHE section with the higher eds is a really model for vagueness that has actually allowed us to put a lot of really good stuff onto the table. So we actually now have an early college dual enrollment strategy between high school and community college going on in early childhood. And you wouldn't find those specifics actually in the application itself. It really just got pledges from the higher ed saying that they would work on alignment, across the sector. Delaware opted, like Colorado here, to try to do things that would bring to bear a focus on credit bearing and credentials, and so is taking advantage of this opportunity to really implement a set of serious wage supplementation that for those at the higher levels of the QRIS based very strictly on the state's career lattice. That just actually started rolling out a couple of weeks ago, and the community response has been tremendous amongst the teachers who are working directly with children in the early childhood programs around the great opportunities. So there is, I think, a structural opportunity in this section that often states talk about but don't get to act on, and to really leverage off of this in a go-forward mode through the challenge.
Thank you. And now measuring outcomes and progress, another choice section, either writing to both or the kindergarten entry assessment or the data section. And Harriet?
Yes, so I know there's going to be a whole seminar on the KEA, and so from even a point counting perspective, I wanted to point out to people that while in the previous round you got competitive points for the KEA, but not for the data systems, leading many states to only put KEA but not data, you could have picked both. And one of the things for people to ponder is really that this is a rare opportunity for data funding, and to try to think about how to take advantage of that if you don't have yet in your state an integrated data system that allows you both to measure for performance and to really help with your ongoing quality improvement. So I wouldn't want people, as they're doing the point counting, to actually just ignore the data aspects of the opportunity. This is also a really nice way in the application, at least as previously structured, to link to K-12 through your KEA, and if there still remains an invitational opportunity that allows you to sustain work into the early elementary grades for those who are really thinking about how do you nest the birth to 5 work and have better continuity into the early grades. Those two things together will allow you an investment strategy and a stakeholder engagement strategy to be able to get that done.
Thank you. I know, Kelly, you had something to say about workforce and maybe about data and KEA.
Thank you. I think I'll stick with the data and KEA, and then I'll go back and I'd like to make another point about workforce. But for the data and KEA, this was one of those things for North Carolina. We talked a lot about whether we were going to go for both or just one of these, but in the end, I think we all agreed we needed to work on our data system in order to be able to build the system we wanted and to be able to know, for example, whether our workforce was meeting our performance measures and things like that. So we were a state that, from the data side, had done some planning, had done more efforts because we had gotten some grants in the K-12 world to develop a state longitudinal data system, but really hadn't done anything yet to integrate data systems across agencies in early childhood. So one of the best pieces of advice I think we got while we were working on the application from somebody who was a lot more expertise than any of us in terms of data systems was to not bite off more than we can chew and to really think about, you've got a 4-year window of opportunity. So you're going to need to spend a lot of time thinking about governance structures and getting agreement as to how you're going to use the data. That's going to take some time. And then putting together even the beginning of infrastructure to allow the data to speak to one another, but not promising that all data about young children will be in this integrated, fabulous system by the end of the grant. And so I think that's an important lesson learned for this round as well. In terms
and
of
a workforce?
And I'll go KEA. KEA, I really just think it's critical that you reach out now and talk to your Department of Education because they're going to need to be a very strong partner in this. And I think you should start with what are you doing now, and does it make sense to build or revise on your current efforts or take a new path. And then back to the workforce, the only thing I really want to hit again is you have performance measures about the workforce. So while you're thinking about what are you going to put in a high-quality plan, the expectation is that you're going to increase statewide numbers of early childhood educators who have particular credentials. So I would really encourage you to think about what are those projects that are most likely going to enable you to reach those statewide targets.
Thank you. And we have about 10 minutes left because we want to leave 5 minutes for Susan to do a summary. And we've got some other issues that we're going to try to do a little faster about budgeting and staffing and planning and schedule, and then leave time for the big lessons learned slide. So we'll let William model that, starting with budgets.
Yeah, thanks, Ken. I'll speak even faster if I need to. So one, get your state experts in you talked about indirect costs. It's not only indirect costs, but it's supporting costs for personnel. So if you're hiring someone, you need to know your fringe and other associated costs. What I mean by minimize erosion is that you're really understanding the true cost for personnel and other assets. Look at other states. Cheat as as a consultant, I always say cheat where you can, but look at what they really did spend. Colorado, we had to do some significant reengineering of our budget from what we put in the grant to from the reality when you start the implementation planning. So really being engaged in the financial piece early. This is not something that you dump on your financial analyst in the last week of the grant. This is something that person, your budget modeling person, is with you from the beginning. And then really make sure that you map HQP to the budget from the start, and that makes your budgeting process much more efficient.
Right. I know in Massachusetts we even ask for soft proposals to get real costs to go with our high-quality plans. Delaware.
One of the quick things, too, is that you really get agreement from your senior stakeholders on those investments early. Can't state that enough, that you want to make sure you're not surprising senior-level people 3 weeks, 4 weeks down the road, because that can be pretty catastrophic.
All right. Delaware on staffing.
Sure. A couple of points on staffing. Some of them follow through from what William was just saying on the budgeting issue, to basically take seriously the projects that you're doing and what the costs will be, which includes staffing for those initiatives and projects. In addition, there is meaningful administrative and financial management and accountability for the work, and you need to plan for that. Kelly talked about the reporting to the feds and the drill downs that are done. And in addition, I think it would be a word to the wise to really think in the staffing structure about who's going to handle the relationship management and the communication with the federal funders and with the federal technical assistance system. Both of these can be pretty big consumers of your time because of their accountability and monitoring responsibilities with you. So you'll need to allocate who's really going to be in charge of those relationships and of facilitating all of that. I wanted to give an example around what happens when you don't pay attention to the budgeting. So in Delaware, no one accounted for having clerical or administrative support to support the program management. And in addition, because in the governance-wise, we created a whole new governance operation to manage this outside of the departmental structures. So we have lovely office spaces with no storage space. That's an issue because we're doing so much community engagement that we actually need a storage warehouse. So we did manage to borrow one from another agency, and we're okay. And we did find a workaround in terms of the administrative assistant and other program slots. But the fact is they hadn't allocated enough state-level positions, and so we had to be very creative. Advanced planning would have helped to have done a more coherent work in terms of what it was actually going to take given the complexity of this and the change process that is expected from this initiative to support implementation and overall systems change.
Thank you. And Theresa, you wanted to talk about the grant writer's responsibility.
Yeah, so first I'll echo what Harriet said. I mean, having enough state staff people to work on this grant and having a dedicated grant administrator from day one on this is really important. It's stunning the amount of work that needs to be done in the first 3 to 4 months of the grant to get the money out the door. And if you don't have somebody who is full-time dedicated to that, it really makes a huge difference in how well you're able to start up your project. So don't count that out in your grant application. So this was just, I was the grant writer. I wasn't brought on initially as the person who was going to run this whole project, but I was somebody from the outside who was hired as a grant writer. And so I just kind of put together what I see as the grant writer's responsibility in all this is really presenting a compelling case. We talked many times about looking at that scoring rubric and maximizing points, but also developing a clear enough plan so that someone who would come in after the grant writer who never even was part of the process would be able to figure out how to implement it, because that does often happen, that it's somebody new. But this last point, and I always say this in working on grants, it's a grant writer's responsibility to minimize the extent to which you will regret having won the money. And my staff here and partners in Illinois love to chide me about this, because the round 2 application, at that point I did know I was going to be the one who was going to be implementing it, and everyone tells me, wow, it was a much different grant the second time around when you knew that it was you who was going to have to do all this work. So, and I say it was actually because the round 1 application, it was all about trying to get the points. In round 2, we had the luxury of writing what it is that we really thought we wanted to do with the money. But I think that's a huge part of a grant writer's responsibility, is going back to people and saying, seriously, do you really think you're going to be able to do that, or are you going to regret this?
Okay, great. And now, William, you've got a couple slides. I'm going to show the one with the bullet points, and then at some point move to the one that's just the planning slide, if you could mention that.
Sure, I can go, and I'll try to be efficient as far as time. So I made this point earlier, and it's a little bit controversial, but I'm not saying exclude stakeholders, but what I'm saying is you can't have a massive 300-party team trying to build your grant. So assess pretty quickly your stakeholders and where they need to be engaged. A RASCI matrix is a fun tool, which is looking at whether, who's responsible, who's accountable, who's supporting, and really just understanding where the stakeholders need to play and where you need them to play in the review. I'm a huge sponsor. I believe fully that you need to have a an owner responsible for the grant. That's critical, not only just for the grant itself, but the state should own it for implementation. Having someone run the grant totally from the outside and then not having continuity when you actually manage it would be a problem. We set up a leadership team that's agile and flexible but senior enough to drive decisions and resolve critical issues around funding and investment. That's essential. It needs to be cross-participating state agencies so you have that buy-in. I'm a big fan of less is more. Smaller production team that is really has accountability. Assurance area owners that own their area that work with the grant writer as a partner to build out a cohesive grant. I'm not for a large-scale, 100-person team trying to make this thing work. First thing I do when I see the grant is to take the guidance and dissect it and boil it down to, I know, again, we've hit this point, understanding the points, understanding the points, understanding the points, understanding the language around points. I hit the HQPs and budgets first because I don't want to have to re-engineer narrative and structure a week before it's due. And then the last thing I do is really take time to really learn where I might have blundered on round one or where I had issues and bullet holes and try to patch those up. The slide that, the Planning Matters slide is just a very simple matrix I use. This is only a fraction of it. It's got about 25 columns across the board, but it's a production matrix. It just allows me to make sure I know every single section that I have, what state it's in, where I really want the completion timelines. This matrix includes everything from who's responsible, accountability, whether or not there's graphics involved, whether or not there's data tables, because the feds love to throw states 2,000 data tables to complete and give you a week to complete them. All those those catch-all things that are happening in the grant. Also really critical to make sure you're way in front of having assurance areas signed, having MOUs structured, having all the I don't mean to offend anybody, but the bureaucratic stuff that takes time to get finished. On our lessons, the next slide, again I'm going quickly, I'm a big believer that budget drives narrative and plan. Some people really have a fundamental issue with that, but that's because I'm a business guy. But it really is true that where you're making the investments is really going to craft what you can do from a planning perspective. I'm big on building the brand and the business case early. The theme here. What's the theme? And this is for those states that have conservative leadership or people who are anti-race to top or anti-federal government. The brand about investment, about good return on investment, about really clearly mitigating future costs, about spending a little less now and having a bigger return later. Some keys: don't underestimate data collection. I think most people probably know that. That's a really huge pain. You cannot contract that out. Do your MOUs the first week as far as, if they're asking for memorandums of understanding. Have a team that's responsible for looking at it, building your appendix, supporting materials, and letters of support. Don't get caught up in the machinations of your executive summary until you really have some idea of your plan. I've seen states spend weeks trying to get that executive summary clear and crisp, and it keeps evolving because the plan and the money below it keeps evolving. I like a single grant writer who's responsible for smoothing out and driving the front end executive summary, meaning that states should drive their own assurance area content out, and the grant writer should be able to put it into clear language. If you want to hire contractors, they're great for overall project management, not sponsorship. There's a difference. Project management, day-to-day project management. Sponsorship is owning this thing. Clearly, you can contract out grant writing. You can also contract out the communication aspects as well as some of the financial modeling. Take time to learn from those that won. Know your real gaps and be honest about your gaps and figure out how to the progress you've made, and also talk honestly about how you're assessing deficiencies. Got to say it again, be consistent with guidance and points. And then this is the grant that when I manage a grant, I'm daily on communication. And we have a scorecard that goes out every night to the grant production team on exactly where we are, where we're not, what we need, and how we need it. That may just be me, but these are very painful to manage and get to completion. I think you all understand that. So as much as you can have good planning and structure and communication, the better off you'll be in the end of the game.
Okay, Theresa, you've got a couple slides on the buckets of work and your lessons from the application.
Yeah, this is just sort of how I divided up some of the tasks that were involved in the grant, and this whole part of research and describing what is in your state is a big bucket of work. People have mentioned the charts that you have to fill out in Section A, and anybody who's already done one of these grants knows exactly what I'm talking about. But someone asked about how did we decide areas of the grant that we did or didn't decide to apply for. We had one of the sections that we had intended to apply for, C3, that we ended up not applying for just because in the end we could never figure out how to get the data that we would be able to fill out the chart, and we knew it was going to be a performance measure chart that we'd have to fill out every year. So we didn't write to that specifically because we couldn't figure out what we currently had and what our current data was and how we would be able to show our progress on that. So huge amount of work on that, but these are kind of ways that you can maybe chop out the developing and writing of the grant. We had 4 people who were working pretty much full-time on developing the grant for 3 months, plus many other people were helping with other parts of it, just for those who haven't been involved in it to have an understanding of the scale of the work that's involved here. Although I will say, as I mentioned before, a lot of that time was devoted both to building the consensus among people and also to bringing in or developing whole sections of actual policy work rather than just on the writing of the grant itself. So our lessons learned from the application is we would say, as someone who lost in round 1, some of the things that we think that maybe led us to lose in round 1 were not understanding who the reviewers were going to be very well. We were assuming that we were going to have very much education folks, like K-12 education kind of people who will be reading this, or education reform people. As it turned out, I mean, you can read the bios of the people who were the reviewers. There were a lot of college professors, particularly in early childhood special ed and family and consumer science programs. And as always is true, you're going to have reviewers who have pet issues. And so we think it's a good idea to have your application read by people who are zealots in different areas, whether that's cultural and linguistic diversity, kids with special needs, family, child care. All of those are potential zealot hot button areas that if you say the wrong thing to one of those people, it will color their whole thinking about you, and you'll knock all sorts of points off for you. So
and I think you made the second point about judging the substantially implemented. We're
right.
running towards the end, so I just want Harriet to give us the last word on her vision to reality, and then we can throw it to Susan. Thanks,
okay,
Susan.
So vision to reality is really a summation of all the great points everyone already made, which is the successful applicants had a great story and they had a compelling narrative and a good vision to go with it. That basically you will need to map your vision back to how you'll proceed because you have got to build an irrefutable case for support for what you're putting out there. I think we've talked about this over and over again. You have got to contextualize the goals and performance measures you set, being careful to reach but not overreaching, and to be thoughtful about what your end goal is, and then think about what is your implementation reality going to be. Consider who you will need, especially your stakeholders, how you'll do the work, and the timeline you'll need in a thoughtful, reality-based way from your startup through full implementation in your planning.
Great. Let me thank Theresa, William, Harriet, and Kelly for their insight. I know everybody's still willing to help as this application comes out, and really want to thank the Early Learning Collaborative for giving us the opportunity to share, and throw it back to Susan.
Thank you so much. I'll be speedy. I mean, I really enjoyed the different perspectives of the presenters. It reminded me a lot of the tension that we were all living in the round 1 phase when people were trying to choose between creating the best plan for their desired comprehensive system and writing to the test and getting the points. And that tension is very real, and I think you've heard different perspectives of how different states took that into account, and the tension between, ambitious and achievable. And then just the loud and clear basic advice about writing a readable application, one with a story, a good storyline, something that connects your past commitment to your future plans. I thought the advice was really helpful, and that for those of you in states, you'll recognize that different different states that spoke today represented more or less closely where your state is. Some of you are trying to coax governors into applying. Others of you are definitely moving forward and applying, but are just trying to figure out how to get more points. So the Early Learning Challenge Collaborative, what I most wanted to say is here to help you. That is the only point of the Early Learning Challenge Collaborative. We want to support your efforts however you're framing your plan. So it's a very big task in a very short timeline. The guidelines should be out any minute now. We'll update the materials that are on the Early Learning Challenge Collaborative website to help you understand the point system. And I just want to mention a few other things that we might be able to help you with. And it's not just BUILD, it's a whole host of consultants and national organizations, some of whom are on the line today, but many, many groups in round 1 and round 2, and now again in round 3 are available to support your efforts if you need that. So the Early Learning Challenge Collaborative raised private funds to support you in things like, for several states in round 3, we've reviewed your round 1 application to give you another perspective, an outside perspective, both on the application, its strengths and weaknesses, and on the federal reviewers. In some cases, as Theresa mentioned, there were reviewers that really hurt a state's chances, particularly those of you who are right on the cusp of the top 14, that just really didn't like a very specific thing. That's a really different kind of review than one where they were concerned about the past commitment. It's something that is changeable easily. So we're happy within the extent of our capacity to review round 1 applications, and have done that already for a number of states. We also can help with other reviews. Once you have drafts of sections, we can line up QRIS experts or assessment experts to look at how you've written your draft section and suggest ways that it might be more clear or more effective. Also, you'll see on the slide that I hope is up, I'm now on a cell phone at a hospital, so I can't see, but we've planned a series of webinars, and we may add some others if you give us feedback that there's another topic that would be more helpful. These webinars that are coming up are mainly on the buckets of the application. So Kelly, who's on the line today, will be one of the people who will talk about the KEA section. And you'll see on the ELC website, ELCC website, that there's a guide to the KEA planning written by Charlie Bruner and Catherine Scott Little. And Catherine will be the other presenter with Kelly on the KEA webinar. So each of those will be sent to all of you, and you can share them with the people in your state who are working on that section of your application. And the last thing I wanted to mention, in addition to thanking all of you for participating and for the presenters for sharing information, is that we're very interested in helping you facilitate cross-state collaborations. It's something that federal officials are very interested in seeing happen. There might be points associated with having cross-state collaborations in pieces of the work. And we at BUILD have just recently come off helping to pull a group of states together to work on a K-3 formative assessment that North Carolina is leading. But there are other kinds of cross-state collaborations that could be part of your Early Learning Challenge grant application. And so if you're looking for other states to partner with on a shared services approach, or on a family engagement strategy, on tailoring professional development materials related to a particular assessment tool, we'd be happy to help you find other states, a sort of matchmaking effort. So thank you so much for participating in this first webinar. We'll be holding many others, and there'll be a survey that pops up when we click stop to let you give us feedback and suggestions for other things that we might be able to do to help you in this tremendous and important effort. And thank you, Sherri, and all of the presenters.
Thank you. Please stand by.